All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Spett. I work at the Leahy Institute. I'm really thrilled to see you all here today. And I'm particularly thrilled to listen to this panel. These are 4 of the most creative, intelligent, inspiring people I've ever met. That is not a lie. And I'm excited for you all to hear about the work that they're doing at UVM and across Vermont. Right now, I'm going to introduce your moderator for this panel. Chris Campany is the executive director of the Windham Regional Commission, which is based in Brattleboro, Vermont. The Windham region consists of 27 towns within a 920 square mile area of southeastern Vermont. And the purpose of the commission is to assist towns to provide effective local government and work cooperatively with them to address regional issues. Prior to being at the Windham Regional Commission, Chris was an assistant professor of landscape architecture and graduate program coordinator at Mississippi State University. You'll hear a little bit more about that today. He's held a tremendous amount of other jobs and has an absolutely gigantic wealth of knowledge about public administration and planning, and developing creative and systems-based solutions to some of our most complex problems. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Master of Public Policy and Administration from Mississippi State and a Master of Landscape Architecture from Louisiana State. So, Chris, why don't you come on up? Woo! Chris Campany.
Good morning. So as you'll hear from my accent, I'm from southeast Vermont, and and so we all have this kind of deep, rich southern tone down there. So thrilled to be here for a lot of reasons. But one of the things I want to talk about before we introduce the panel, and Emma, when did you want them to come up? Do you want them to come up now, or well? I'll deal with that later. In my life, I really didn't realize this when I was living it, but the role that land-grant universities and the 3 pillars of research, teaching, and service have played to kind of get me where I am now, which at this moment is standing here. But to my mind, universities have an important role in helping us understand our collective stories and the stories that we're participating in. And one of my favorite writers is a guy named Wendell Berry. He says the significance and ultimately the quality of the work we do is determined by the story in which we're taking part. And to my mind, what this panel is going to be discussing, which is data, drones, maps, other things to kind of help support the work within Vermont's rural communities, is so important, and it's such a key thing that universities can do. And when I first, years ago, well, not years ago, gosh, it was just 2 years ago, was reaching out to universities on behalf of the regional planning commissions, because I could speak academese and regional planning commissionese. We came to UVM, met with the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and also met with Kirk. And when Kirk was describing how the Office of Community Engagement was growing into becoming this Leahy Institute for Rural Partnerships, because of his background with land grants previously, I understood exactly what the purpose of this entity is. And I was so thrilled, because in Southeast Vermont, I was really trying to figure out how do we better engage with UVM, not only the faculty, but also the students, because it felt like we were really far away. I'd actually really turned most of my attention to UMass Amherst because they're closer. So when I heard about, really learned more about the Office of Engagement and the vision for the Institute, I've seen this before. And where I saw it was when I was at Mississippi State University working on my undergrad and first master's. There was the Stennis Institute of Government and all these other institutes. And there in Mississippi, the university was just kind of ever present in so many communities through extension service, through research, through various centers and applied research entities. And then later, when I went to Louisiana State University to pursue my master's in landscape architecture, it was the same thing. LSU was kind of everywhere. It was just kind of ever present. And critically in those states as well, the HBCU, historically black college and universities, 1890 land grants too. I previously did a lot of work in agriculture and support for rural communities. And there, especially those HBCUs, those HT90 land grants, I worked a lot with especially Southern University in Louisiana, really served the underserved communities and the historically discriminated against black communities and the black farmers in those areas. And just seeing how the universities could become part of the solution across such a wide array of areas, I was trying to figure out how to access UVM to kind of bring their research and knowledge and also get the student engagement in these local communities. And so really thrilled to see this partnership. And a little bit about just the thread of land grants in my life. I grew up in southwestern Virginia in a little town called Abingdon, kind of the gateway to Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. I know they call people from away from Vermont flatlanders, but our peaks were 5,700 feet. And then also kind of the southern gateway to the coal country across the Clinch River. If you've ever read Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, there's this line I love, it says, Southwest Virginia, we're one damn thing after another. And there's a lot of truth to that. My family is from Mississippi, and my dad's family specifically from Shelby in the Mississippi Delta. And my mom from Columbus in the Black Prairie Belt in the eastern part of the state. And looking back, there are photos of my grandmother when she was a dietitian at the local school at the Mississippi State University Extension Service learning about nutrition. My dad went to Mississippi State after serving under the GI Bill and got his degree in industrial business and enabled him to help provide a life for us that was you wouldn't necessarily expect from a family in the Delta. And growing up where I lived in Southwest Virginia, Virginia Tech was kind of ever present, especially through the Cooperative Extension Service. So there's just been this constant thread. And in my life, as a student, when I worked on my master's in public administration, I was interviewing shrimp fishermen about the socioeconomic impacts of sea turtle protection measures on the coast, while we learned not only how to do things like interviews, but also how not to get thrown into the water because they were really mad. And I was a guy with a clipboard and had a certain amount of official appearance there. But also helped draft legislation on initiative and referendum and lobby law reform. And that kind of set me up to become eventually a presidential management intern with EPA. And when I decided to leave there, went to LSU to work on my master's in landscape architecture, had an urban design class in historically black community between the LSU campus and downtown, was the aegis for a sustainable agriculture and community food security project, and created a nonprofit organization. And I mean, it was an incredible opportunity to then engage with both LSU and Southern to kind of actually bring those universities together. And this is just a little bit of my story, but these stories are repeated, hundreds of thousands of times across the country. So seeing this portal to UVM kind of emerge to further engage with the communities is awesome. And the project that I put in last year for the first round it may sound really simple, but basically it's trying to map wastewater systems in Vermont because we don't really have those maps. And why is this important for something that may seem pretty basic? Until you understand where the systems are, what the capacity of those systems are, and the condition of those systems, you don't know where you can actually build housing or other significant economic development. And we tend not to talk about that in the legislature or elsewhere. We've talked a lot more about regulation and permitting and that kind of thing, but foundational to the housing development that we need, which is multifamily and a lot of it, right? We're talking tens of thousands of units. You have to know where this stuff actually is and what our capacity actually is to know what we're actually capable of doing. And so this effort, it's going to be, and we'll go through that more in depth of that project, but that's being led by faculty and with engagement of students. They're going to be looking at the data the states have, that the municipalities have, and we're going to see what kind of maps we can piece together and what kind of story we can tell to ultimately tell the story of what quantity of housing can we support where. And it's a really important thing. Again, it's I really appreciate Tricia kind of elevating the importance of this project, because when you first hear about it, it's like you're mapping wastewater systems, what the heck. But it's a story we as Vermonters need to understand and tell ourselves, and it's really challenging in our municipal environment here, because we distribute planning and responsibility for systems across more than 250 units of government. And this is an issue for northern Vermont as a whole. And one of the things I hope is going to come out of this is building up of the public administration program at UVM, not only for Vermont, but for, I would say, northern New England as a whole, to lead on that. So with that, I'm going to introduce the panel. Come on up. First, we have Paige Brochu with UVM Spatial Analysis Lab. We've got Holly Morehouse with the Vermont Community Foundation. Kendall Fortney with the Vermont Research Open Source Office. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Y'all want to start introducing yourselves first, and then we'll start with the questions for ourselves.
Sure, yeah, so I am Paige Brochu. I am the director of the Spatial Analysis Lab over in the Aiken Center, and I'm also an assistant research professor in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources.
Hi, I'm Holly Morehouse. I'm the vice president for grants and community impact at the Vermont Community Foundation. If you don't know the Community Foundation, please reach out, because we'd like to get to know you. We exist to make Vermont's communities stronger. The Community Foundation is here for emergencies and disasters like the flooding in 2023, so that Vermont could have a coordinated, effective, philanthropic effort in response, and we are here for the long haul. The Community Foundation was founded in 1986, and we have the structure and stability to be here in 2086 and beyond. So we're also here for those long, intractable solutions and challenges that we've been talking about these 2 days.
Hello, my name is Kendall Fortney. I run the open source program office called VERSO, Vermont Research Open Source Program Office is the long name. What we focus on at UVM is supporting open source software development, open research, open data, open science. We've been around for about 2 years and change at this point. We're the beginning of a vanguard of a bunch of these institutions across the US, doing these academic institutions across many R1 universities out there, and they're actually all coming here the end of this week to go talk about it, which is really exciting. In that process, we ended up doing something around student internship teams, working on this kinds of projects where we're building stuff openly and working with partners outside of UVM to do that work, which we'll talk a little bit more further on, and that's kind of the exciting part of it. Thank you.
Great. So the first question is, what are some of the key challenges you've identified in Vermont communities in your respective work?
Yeah, I can go first. So I think one of the things that we've noticed as a challenge in Vermont is kind of looking at data equity and data accessibility, right? In the Spatial Analysis Lab, or the SAL as we like to call ourselves, we normally produce really great high-resolution data, whether it be tree canopy assessments, LiDAR, which is elevation, or anything else. But one thing that's really difficult here is translating that data and that science back to the communities that actually need that data to then enact change. So data equity, I think, is something that's a challenge in Vermont, but not only in Vermont, but across the nation as well. So that's one kind of key point that I have.
Great. And Holly, how about you?
Yeah, I'm actually going to bring some data to this conversation since we're a panel about data. As a community foundation, in the fall, we do a statewide survey out to all our grantee organizations, and in 2023, there were over 4,000 organizations that the Community Foundation and its fund holders sent more than $44 million out in 2023. So we got a nice pool of data there. And one of the questions that we ask is, of the nonprofits and the municipalities and the schools, what are you most concerned about? What are you seeing, over the next 5 years? And in 2022, the overwhelming answer and feedback was community division, right? And it wasn't just straight newcomers and oldcomers. It was the older residents saying no one's volunteering, and the younger residents saying things move too slow when I volunteer. It was like the techies versus the traditionals. Like it just showed up in all these different ways. And when I was listening to Tony Pippa yesterday, right, he had that wonderful point about community collaboration. And so, and how do we build that? And a number of the things that we're looking at with the Community Foundation is placemaking. So partnering with Richard and Maury in Better Places, and we have, I think, more than 15 programs that are focused on place, and over $1 million going out. And how do you help people feel connected in their place? The other thing in 2023, when we asked the same question, so this is coming out of the floods, it was how do we, as communities, make decisions in a changing and challenging climate? That was the overwhelming question. And when I think about that, and I think about the data needed there, I draw back to, what data do Vermont communities need for technical solutions? And what data do Vermont communities need for adaptive solutions? And how do we make sure we have both? So a technical solution being something that we know how to do. After the flooding, how do you build a bridge? Technical solution, technical data. Or using Rose's example this morning, how do you build a skate park? We know how to build a skate park. Adaptive solutions, being those problems that we don't know all the information, so you're gonna have to do it incrementally. You're gonna have to learn as you go. You're gonna have to pull in all these different voices. So the graffiti example, or using the young boys to design the skate park. Around climate change, we're going to need both. The other thing that we hear people talk about, and there isn't a problem, I'd say, that we're working on that doesn't drive back to housing. And it also comes true for me there as well. We're helping to support the zoning atlas so that we can have maps of zoning to answer some of the spatial questions about housing. And then when we actually work in communities, it's not the data, it's the relationship questions about what communities are ready for housing and how do we pull them together and what facilitators do we get in that space so they can have those conversations. So data, relationships, adaptive, technical, and civic collaboration. How do we support all of those with data?
Ken?
I think I'm gonna go a little more philosophical. So when I was in middle school here, I grew up in southern Vermont, I was a legislative page. And that meant I went to the State House and I handed physical notes between legislators. I remember riding in the back of Representative Dick Sears, who sadly just passed, listening to Green Day on the way up because it was the 90s. And it was a very interesting experience. It was like you walk into that State House. I remember leading the Pledge of Allegiance for the first joint session, and you never realize how much you don't know the words of the Pledge of Allegiance till you stand up in front of those people and try to say it. So like the aspect of being engaged was always part of that. Later on in my life, I went to school for fine arts. I ended up going into startups and technology here, and I left a job at one point to teach myself Python, do data science. And I met John Adams, who runs the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, so the state agency around geospatial data. And he invited me to become the first fellow there and bring in some of the experience I had outside into their amazing agency. And in those two pieces, like, it was hard to unwind the connection between being both a person that lives here and being a person that's engaged with the state in that way, with the place and the communities that we live in. So I'm gonna fast forward a tiny bit more, and just before COVID, I had a child, and we were trying to decide whether to buy or rent at that time. I'm a data nerd, so I did a spreadsheet of the costs. Years later, we decided, we rented at that time. Years later, I go back to that. I'm like, okay, so that was literally 2 months before COVID hit. What happened to housing prices, to those houses that I looked at? There's one house that I saw that sold for $165,000. And it was like a 2-bedroom. A month before COVID. A year later, the houses that were the same price were selling for 3 times that. So the nature of housing, like, I regret not buying then, because man, I could get like a 3-bedroom for under 200, crazy. And I see that problem affects a lot of communities here. I came back to the state because I love this place. I think it fits a lot of me. And to live here requires finding the ability to actually buy and stay. Getting the opportunity to actually find people that not only see that, but see the value in adding data to that problem to try to solve how we do that is incredible. And I hope working with the students to encourage that importance of that service, that thing to something larger than themselves, as part of what we demonstrate in our teams to show what that looks like, as well as actually delivering data. That we do a lot of outreach in our teams to outside of UVM, to calling a lot of wastewater people and be like, hey, what do you guys have in that case? Or talking to zoning people, talking to all those different aspects as part of the outreach and learning that aspect of service, and also demonstrating what it looks like when we work well as partners with all these agencies, which is been phenomenal and kind of inspirational to see that and demonstrate that.
If I can just briefly, I just want to add a regional planning commission perspective. So there are 11 regional planning commissions in Vermont. In the absence of county government, we serve as an essential link between local, state, and federal government. And the way we're structured now, primarily we have performance-based grants. We tend to do more what the legislature would like us to do, but our critical role remains providing support for all the municipalities in the state. And I mean direct support. So many of the things that we deal with are just questions like, how do we warn a meeting? How do we abide by open meeting law? Or, we also support them in things like developing their town plans and zoning, but also hazard mitigation plans, energy plans, transportation plans, natural resources, conservation. And what I'm seeing, I wrote a piece for the Vermont Digger telling ourselves the story of our towns and their limitations, is in my regular daily work now, since I've been here about going on 14 years. And when I first came on, my hiring was actually delayed because they were talking about getting rid of regional planning commissions through a process called Challenger for Change. Then Irene hit, and state government and legislature realized, oh, RPCs are really where all this stuff comes together. And what I'm seeing now after the pandemic and after disaster after disaster after disaster is I'm seeing towns kind of breaking, and I'm seeing our governance structure kind of breaking down. Because while we want to defend the local decision making, there's also this challenge of actually being able to accomplish the things the communities need to have if you can't do it at a scale where you can actually achieve the things that you need to do. And housing is big among them. And the other big issue is a lot of towns are now so busy recovering from the last disaster that trying to look ahead to do things that are big are challenging. And right, these are towns that, and I'm not kidding, like in our towns, our largest population is Brattleboro, 12,000, smallest is Somerset, population of 6. And what I'm increasingly seeing is it can take towns, and I'm not kidding, multiple years to decide to have a conversation, much less have a conversation and make a decision and act. And especially with all the funding that's been coming down, it's really stressed them out. A number of towns have struggled to determine how to use their own ARPA funding, like the funding they're totally in control of because they don't want to make a bad decision. They're not used to making those decisions. And when you start talking about infrastructure and things that may change a town, it's even harder. And so the role of RPCs, oftentimes we're in the background. You don't really even see us, but we provide this major supporting role. But this is, to my mind, a key research question around needing to tell the story of ourselves about our structure of government and governance, and our ability to actually implement higher level policy decisions and how to better support decision making at the local level. And this is why the work that you guys are doing, the data is so important, and empowering the towns to make the decisions themselves, because the research shows if you have a cohort group, you can bring them all the information you want, but if you empower them to make those decisions themselves, they tend to have more successful outcomes. So I'll start next page. How do you use data, tools, and other innovations to address the challenges you talked about?
Yeah, so I just want to, maybe this is actually answering the third question, but I feel like that you just brought up a really good point there about how us as the SAL, but also as a university can really empower communities to make those decisions. And I think that we have so much expertise, so many resources here within the university that I think, the flood last year just showed how we can actually respond to the community's needs with our resources, with the technical expertise, with everything that we have in-house, to then hopefully, one, help communities in that immediate need, but then also plan for the future. I think that we just have such a wealth of knowledge here, and that's one thing that I truly enjoy now about being back within the university is the community engagement aspect of this.
Holly?
Can I just build on that, because I love what you both are saying about scale. And we talked a lot, and we do, about capacity challenges in communities, which are very real. I remember visiting a town, I was town administrator, 10 days after the flood. She hadn't slept in those 10 days. She had 29 FEMA applications she was working on. It was just overwhelming. And there was something so amazing, and I'm sure many of us saw those stories in the immediate aftermath of the flood, that it was the hyper-local who had the data and the information about who needed help. They knew which roads were washed out, who had needed access to medication, they knew the family situation, they knew what to move, and I don't know about all of you working on the flood, but we were making those phone calls out and seeking out the hyper-local in all the towns that were impacted, because that was the value that Vermont's communities could bring in that moment. You know, now, almost a year out from the flooding, we're sitting in a different place, and we need a different scale of data, because we can't right now answer the question in the state of Vermont, how many houses and homes still need to be repaired or rebuilt. We don't have that at an aggregate level, but yet it's an aggregate problem, because we need to figure out what to do with the remaining philanthropic dollars. We need to figure out how many sheets of plywood need to be bought across the state. We need to know how to allocate. We've got volunteers, crews coming from all over the nation, Mennonite crews and Methodist crews, and they come in for a week, and they're here for project, build-ready projects, and they want to get out and work on homes, and we're struggling in some cases to say where those homes are, and we're going to miss, right, this moment in time. And that requires like an aggregate answer, and for the Community Foundation in that space, our approach has been like, well, what is the data tool that communities need? Well, they need a common data source. They need to be able to put their data into a common place. So we've been working with this national foundation that does emergency disaster recovery all over the nation. They know how to do this, and they know how to take someone who is used to responding to social services or poverty relief and teach them how you go into a home and you do a building assessment and a cost assessment, and you turn that into data and you put it into these systems, and how you do data sharing agreements and so forth. So different scales, right? Different challenges exist at different scales, and our data exists at different scales. And yes, we need to be pushing out solutions, and we also need to be using the strengths that we have to pull in, right, that local and hyper-local information.
Kendall?
I think what's also interesting is how you present data. So like we have a lot of data. Part of why I love this data is like, hey, if you have a problem, you can usually ask someone and find someone that knows something pretty quickly. And I find that actually the difficulty is there's so much opportunity, it's actually narrowing down things. But when we talk about people understanding data, understanding information, there's various levels. And if I'm writing, pulling up a data summary for, say, a professor that's working in research versus someone that is at a small town in Bennington, Vermont, where I grew up, trying to understand that, those are two very different things. Like if I give someone in Bennington like a GIS data set, and they're just only able to access that on their phone, like what does that look like? So it's really, like as someone with a background in design and those aspects, it's really important to think about how we design these things to be accessible at the level of the people who need to make those choices. And we've had some interesting conversations about, okay, so policymaking, like how do they need to understand this? What do they need to understand? At what scale do they need to understand it? And really being targeted in both collecting good data, but also presenting it in a way that's really useful to the people that use it. And I find that, VCGI has an amazing collection of data sets. I use it for things they never imagined. I do 3D printing off of LiDAR data, so I make 3D prints of mountains in Vermont. Like, that is a totally achievable thing. They don't think about that when they're making those data sets. And there's all these interesting aspects of how you think about people using the information you're creating. And make it accessible, especially in like emergency situations. I mean, like the floods were very real. I did some work on OpenStreetMaps. I talking to Arleth when he was doing spatial droning. Like my partner was doing stuff around in Facebook and community, community stuff. Like there's so much about Vermont that brings us together in those spaces, and finding ways to make that data both aware of those resources and accessible, I think can really empower people, individual people, to actually make notable changes in how we do stuff, which is great.
So I'd like to ask a question you're not prepared for.
Bring it on.
So oftentimes, right, we use data to look back. And one of our challenges, I think, is especially, given our governance structure and expecting these 250 units, which are largely, empowered with self-determinant, what's going to happen in those communities, we tend to look back. How are you guys using information to try to help communities successfully look forward, not only to anticipate, but to act in anticipation? And conversely, what challenges have you had doing that? Because that's part of my life. It's a ever-present challenge, but I'd love to get your all's take on it.
I mean, I think I can kind of talk to that a tiny bit. I think the aspect of that is being like, it's probably going to be wrong. Like, it's setting expectations. We can guess. Any good AI model is only accurate to the general, right? Like, it's thinking about any of that kind of modeling and be like, hey, this is a guess. And the important thing is building an iteration on that. That you're not just like, not only is this not set in stone, but if the stone starts moving, we got to move it. And accepting that as a ground level truth. I think it's hard when you're talking about governance and you're talking about governments. They expect it to be the truth and the set and the solid and the stagnant. And that isn't the way this world is currently moving, and in multiple levels. So how do we build flexibility into those conversations to admit that things may not be right for the future, things that we know that in the past may not be true? How do we learn to build the patterns of adjustment and iteration to make that function?
It brings to mind for me the great graphic we got to see yesterday. I think it was Dominic's that had the left brain and the right brain, and the need for both. And data, the quantitative data will often give us that left brain, and it looks so neat and orderly. And we all know you can make a graph, and whoa, it looks like it's truth, right? But that right brain, he had it was relationships and yearning and art, and to me that's like the Space on Main conversations, where you're pulling people around the table and envisioning together, or like the stories that were shared on the podcast about how can we see the homes differently, so that we're looking at the homes that are really making our community a strong place. So I think we need both, and we need to constantly be in relationship with both. The thing that I worry about is going back to that capacity thing is to build that quantitative data, right, at the local level over and over again is a big time sink, for all those FEMA applications, or for all the things, right? And what I'm really hopeful for is that some of the work that you all are doing here will alleviate some of that burden, so that communities can be on those broader right brain conversations, using the left brain data.
Can I, just to add on that briefly, I mean, one of the challenges we're facing right now for FEMA hazard mitigation work is towns have to maintain detailed information, not only about overall what happened in the last disaster, but each culvert, each bridge, each stretch of road. They need pictures, they need force hours, they need equipment hours, they need everything, how much time was it shut down? And they have to replicate that every time, because that can't just live on the dashboard of a road foreman's truck. It's got to live someplace where it's accessible, and there's so much turnover you can't. So I just wanted to add that to just really highlight that if you have that distributed across 250 plus units of government, it's really hard, and that's why in the past it's been hard to really draw down, and I can talk later about hazard mitigation grant funding. It's been hard to draw down that money because we haven't had the data to be able to draw down. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that I think Kendall and Holly brought up two really good points. One is being flexible, and models can show us so much, but just like your housing chart, right? It's like, oh, well, it all kind of goes away when reality kind of sets in, and we can only plan for the future so much, but also bringing in the communities to ask, how do they want to actually plan for the future? They're the ones that are living in these communities that have been hit by the floods, that have been hit by other extreme events. So really talking with them about where do they see themselves going, right? Because the floods happened, and some of those communities are rebuilding, but we also have to talk with them about, is it actually feasible to rebuild in floodplains as streams and rivers from this flooding event have shifted? So are they going to be continuing to be flooded, every few years, because we had 200-year floods in a matter of 10, 15 years? But there was also another point that I wanted to make, was not just hazard mitigation, but that preparation aspect. So one thing that we're really focused on is training the next kind of generation of geospatial experts that can organize and manage these massive data sets that we have, but also training first responders to use the technology that we have within the spatial analysis lab, but also within the university, to then actually respond. So it's not just, I think that the SAL and what Jarlath did last summer was phenomenal. I mean, I think we spent hundreds of hours. Our techs and our drone team was working, 12, 18-hour days. Maybe I shouldn't say that at the university, but we were working round the clock, right, to do these missions, to fly, to capture damage assessments, to figure out where the flooding was happening, capture those high water marks, so then folks, residents, businesses could get the FEMA money, almost a month ahead of time before, on the ground damage assessments had to go out. But we also want to train that next generation of first responders so that it's not just on us, we can actually share that knowledge. So actually today we are doing one of our first FEMA workshops where we are training FEMA first responders to actually utilize drones in a disaster kind of event, and what to do, how to fly the drone, how to process that data, and then how to distribute it in a way that is accessible for the public, for communities, to actually use that to, make these decisions to apply for funding and all of that.
Great. And we already talked about this some, but specifically from more of an organizational perspective, what role do you see your own entities playing in collaboration with partners to build a better Vermont? And we'll start with you again, Paige.
Yeah, so one thing that I think one reason why the Spatial Analysis Lab, and I think as a university as a whole, we were successful, seems like the wrong word to use in a disaster response and relief effort, but was really the way that we've built relationships within the communities in the past. So we were getting calls from community members, from the state, from first responders during the flooding event last year, who we had already had kind of long-standing relationships with, where they could trust that we were not going to, fly drones and fly them without getting authorization or anything like that. We were gonna then be providing that data back to them, and they had that trust in us. And I think that is one way that the SAL in the future can continue kind of creating a better Vermont, is really listening to the community and engaging and building on these relationships that, one, we already have, but that we can continue to grow.
I already spoke a little bit about our work at this point in flood recovery and how to support the long-term recovery groups, which are, if you don't know, they're grassroots, ad hoc, often volunteer-based, and when FEMA leaves, which most of the FEMA folks and programs left in March, those are the groups that are left on the ground to get people back in their homes. And really understanding that many of those folks, there are a few exceptions, but many had not been through a disaster of this scale and didn't know how to move in that space. So working with partners around the state, bringing in expertise, I think as Vermont, we don't need to be shy when we need to bring in expertise from a national level or from other states that have had experience with similar things and how to play that out. I also want to call on this example in another area of our work around education and training, when I want to make sure that when we're in these spaces, they're actually getting the right data to answer the right question in the right way. And sometimes that can be tricky when you're in these really complex spaces. And we're partnered, one of our affiliate organizations is the McClure Foundation that's working with CCV and VSAC and the Agency of Ed and ourselves. And it's about how do we make post-secondary education the easy choice for Vermonters, right? All those young people that we talked about yesterday. How do we keep them here? How do we make that the easy choice? And you can look at the data in Vermont, and you can look at it at the state level or in the districts, and you can see that young Vermonters are graduating from high school, but they're not continuing on. And one of the strategies is how to offer credential programs and degree programs and an associate's degree, and make an associate's degree free through through CCV, and so thinking about messaging and how do we do that outreach. And then when you go to that next layer of the data, you discover that it's really boys and young men that aren't continuing at an even greater pace. Right, so how does that change your messaging? How does that change your approach, and how do you reach them? And then you go to the next level and you get out of the quantitative and you go into the qualitative. And that group has been doing empathy interviews with young men all across the state to ask those questions. And what it has really led to is a complete, a different change in the messaging and the approach and so forth. So I think when I think about our partners, it's walking through those paths of, are we answering the right question? Do we have the right data to answer the right question? Do we have the quantitative, but have we balanced it, with the qualitative? And how do we be in those spaces, whether it's flood or whether it's post-secondary education?
Great.
I think it's interesting because there's a couple different pieces that UVM fits into this. I think one part for my office and what I care about when it comes to open science is how do we take the stuff that's happening here at UVM and have it have impacts here and elsewhere? How do we convert all the amazing research that's being done here, all the amazing thoughts, all the amazing abilities, all the random skills that I find in people here, and have that drive impact? And that is capacity, right? There's people here that can do amazing things. How do we actually bring that outside, get engagement, and make it sustainable and fits the places that we're bringing it to? Because it's easy to have a really cool idea and be like, you should just do this thing. That doesn't actually change anything. It's actually engaging with people. I've had a lot of fun bringing different projects from people, like professors at UVM, creating cool projects and bringing them in the community and having like a UX experience on their stuff and getting that feedback. I brought people inside of the city of Burlington into a UX group to get feedback on their data portal. Like there's this element of exposure and getting outside the silos that allow you to do really impactful things. So I think my role in this institution is to find ways to do that. Through open science, through community engagement, through doing cool projects with lots of random people, finding new friends. The other part is training students, faculty, and staff in this. These skills aren't innate. They're not easy to do. It's taken me a while to learn how to do speaking at all, right? Like most people can't do that kind of thing, and talking to people on phones is especially hard for teenagers. So like, how do you think about those aspects of training people in these things? How they think about communicating to others is a big, important part of what we want to do. And I think those things build capacity. It's been interesting that, talking to the state and finding ways that we add capacity at UVM to what they can do. We can do crazy things, go out, do a lot of work on building new data sets that didn't exist. They can maintain those things. That's really cool. That's a unique partnership. So there's ways that we think about how we add capacity to problems, but also how we train the people that we're working with on how to do that well, how to communicate, collaborate, and demonstrate those skills. And I think that's going to be always evolving. Like I keep finding new groups inside of UVM that I know the Spatial Lab from before because of VCGI, but there's all these different groups inside of UVM that you kind of find as you're sometimes going to conferences in other places hilariously, and you're like, oh, you do that? And be like, how can I help you? And building out those pieces and making those partnerships with the state, with regional partners, with local partners, with nonprofits, with foundations, allows us to understand the needs and match what we're doing here to meet those needs.
I just wanted to jump in real quick too, because I think that education outreach is a really important kind of sector that the university and the SAL as well can almost, just speaking from the SAL, is that we can get better at, right? So we actually just partook in the BHS Yes program, which was like a 2-week-long high school class where at the end of the school year, the high school students have to take some class outside of the high school itself. So we did one called Drones to Satellites, and it was really interesting because half the class was really interested in computer science and all of that, and the other half the class just wanted to go outside and play basketball. So it was really kind of figuring out a way of being flexible and being kind of revising our lessons so that they weren't just sitting behind a computer trying to make a map for an hour. We were actually out on campus exploring, kind of getting excited too about different ways in which we can use drones and satellites, not just to answer questions about the urban heat island or tree canopy or flooding or what have you, but other ways in which like recreational drone use is really exciting. And I think also showing the students that there's other kind of career opportunities and other paths forward than just the classic engineer or nurse pathway. And I think that's just getting students really excited about other work that they can do that maybe they didn't know about beforehand.
I love how you're doing that. That makes it so exciting, and for me it opens up the potential of reaching some of those places that aren't reaching out. Like when I think as a funder, some of the most important data is the data we don't actually have, right? It's the communities that aren't applying for grants or that we're not hearing from. And as a funder, and I think with the Leahy Institute too, as you're rolling out the grants, really thinking about, okay, we're hearing from these places, but nothing. I mean, for us, we've been prioritizing Essex County and Franklin County and Grand Isle County and really in a concentrated way, doing some outreach there and changing our processes, because it's easy as a funder to say, here's the process, or as a provider of resources to say, here's the process of how you work with us. How do we flip it? Like what you're doing with the students, how do we flip it to be like, how do we work with you? How do we show up in a different way in your community? There were a couple of comments yesterday about philanthropy not showing up in the rural spaces. the Community Foundation is, and is doing that hard work of how do we get out there and how do we be in those spaces in a different way. So I love what you're doing with students so much and I hope we can use that to get them to some of the spaces that aren't coming to us.
And I'll just share, I'm glad this conversation's taken this turn because especially the role of the university in a very rural state, it can be difficult to get kids to see where they go. And I'll admit, by the time I graduated high school, my brother had already graduated Davidson College, University of Chicago, was a loose scholar, and I wanted to walk around the woods and work on cars. And so when I went to Mississippi State, I majored in forestry. But I didn't have the calculus foundation to kind of get me through. Didn't really know about dropping classes, I thought. So instead of taking my calculus exam, I went fishing. But then I discovered political science, and I saw what the department was doing to apply that, the work of the university to people's lives. And it set me on a path that otherwise, not that walking around the woods and working on cars would have been a bad thing, but it really kind of turned me on to something else. So it's awesome that you guys are engaging with students, and I'm on the outside of the academy, so I can say this. I wish in promotion and tenure world, service and teaching would be elevated beyond just research. I get the politics and the funding and all that, but I'm on the outside, I can say this. But I really do, especially in a rural state like Vermont, I think the service aspect and bringing that down to the kids in the high schools and even before about how UVM, how research and all is relevant to you is so critical to kind of show them a pathway that otherwise they might never see. So that's so important. One thing I want to bring up is I've lived and worked in a lot of states, Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, New York, Maryland, and DC. I find New England to be profoundly insular in its outlook. If it didn't happen in New England, yeah. But of course, and then Vermont is it just drills down. And the towns that we work with, right? Like some of our towns, one part of the town doesn't really associate with another part because people are so hyper-focused on their specific place, their physical place within that town. And sometimes when I work with towns, I'll say, hey, Townsend, have you seen what Newfane's doing? These are adjacent towns. It's no, we have no idea what they're doing. Why would we care what they're doing? That's Newfane, we're Townsend. And I love these towns dearly, but we're doing something kind of radical in our region. We're working with 4 towns. In this case, we're using UMass Amherst to help support a intermunicipal housing design charrette, where it might. So looking at housing from a 4-town perspective, where does it actually make sense to build housing? Where does it make sense to build that infrastructure? Does it have to be within your town, or maybe do infill here, but you can get the larger gain someplace else? And that's kind of viewed as radical. Whereas actually, if you work at county level planning, it's normal. Not saying we could or should have county government, but what I want to ask you guys is, from where you sit, how do you bring information about other places and things that are going on, good ideas that may be worth considering at our kind of hyper local level to really kind of affect change, not just at the state policy level, but at that local decision, where do we invest municipal dollars level?
Meetings. I feel like recently my calendar has been quite full of just meetings with other institutions, other organizations, and even people who kind of do what the Spatial Analysis Lab do, so potential competitors, about what are some solutions that they're coming up with that we could bring locally or nationally. So meetings is the first answer that I have.
So going where people are too, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Kendall?
Yeah, there's a lot of different conferences I attend. I don't belong to a specific domain. I'm not just computer science. My background isn't computer science. So I was at a rural entrepreneurship symposium last week, and there was an interesting, and that was run here out of UVM, and there was an interesting piece of that where they were talking about rural areas, because it's all about rural entrepreneurship, that their greatest strength and weakness is their local networks, because in some ways they have very tight groups and they really support each other, but also they never look beyond their tight groups. And anyone that's run businesses inside of Vermont are hey, if you're gonna run a business here, you have to think more than just Vermont. We're not that big. So you have to think about that larger network. So it's kind of interesting to see that replicated in that specific example. The other thing is podcasts. There's so many times I just sit and listen to different podcasts. There's some amazing, very wonky podcasts around policy, around innovation and technology that I do just to keep up with the things that are happening. I've always, someone that does art, and I've done art with AI, like I'm fascinated by the evolutions in that space. And you have to like listen to this stuff to find out what's happening every week. And because the walks between meeting spaces in this campus are so large, I usually get it done by the end of the day. So it's always interesting to find that. The conferences are always interesting to hear different perspectives, especially if they're not in your domain, to get that kind of translation of that.
Great. Holly?
All my formal education and training as a geographer, and the first thing that comes to mind are those like really cool maps that change your perspective, where the North Pole is the South Pole, or it's centered on China instead of like the U.S., and how those make you think differently, and thinking about efforts we have in Vermont that, like the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, right? And how do we look across that way, and what that means to work in those ways. The other piece that it brings to mind for me is, I just lost my thought. The maps and, darn.
No pressure.
No. I don't know. I might have to come back to it. But the maps is really one. Who's not at the table is another one. And I had another great thing that I'm going to have to think about for a second.
Well, if it comes back, let us know.
All right. Thank you.
I feel like I lemonade in like the rocking chairs at the airport and just kind of sit here and just talk.
So we had wanted to engage with y'all. So let's do. That's a good time. And if you come up with your thought.
No, I'm hoping someone will trigger it for me.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how you're handling the microphones or if there are any questions, but even just want to muse on something, riff on something. Yes. And somebody else, the lights are kind of bright, so it's hard for me to see what's going on out there. This must be what it's like to be a rock star.
Really interesting conversation. What's your biggest gap right now in data that's hard for you to access to do your work better?
Oh man, I just thought of my thing. Thank you so much. Holy crap, I owe you. I was thinking about, we've been hearing about the federal data and the opportunities in front of us. And one, I think that maybe our towns, and I have been on community visits, and it's really thinking within the boundaries of our towns, but I think our nonprofits may offer some of the key. I think nonprofits in our state are good at collaborating across the state and with each other, and going to conferences and pulling new ideas in, and we're going to need that kind of collaboration as a state to get any of those federal dollars they're talking about, whether it's the digital equity dollars or it's the environmental justice dollars. So I think we're going to need both to know how to collaborate and think differently at scale, and then we're going to need the data across the state to feed into those pieces. And in a way that is more sustainable than, Chris, what you were talking about the individual culverts.
Yep.
But we need it kind of soon, because those opportunities are happening now, and Vermont's gonna miss out. So in some cases, I'm like, it needs to be like this, all hands on deck, and what are the big opportunities in front of us, and who can move in those spaces.
Paige and Kendall, y'all want to take a crack?
I feel like one thing that's kind of interesting about this is like it's hard to be like, oh, this specific data set. There's some things that are changing so rapidly, like so floodplains, right? I think the last FEMA was 2010, and the landscape's changed a lot. And there's people that can do that work and kind of figure those things out. It's sitting there and like both making sure that's being done iteratively as the ground truth keeps on changing, and then understanding how to compile that in a meaningful form that's understandable. Like I think there's a lot of data that we already have, and there's more that we need to adjust as we discover things are changing, and the ways we pull that together to make decisions and model the choices that we make, making data-driven choices on policy, data-driven choices in a university around our lives. Like there's a transference from data to to choices that I think is actually a difficult missing point that I keep trying to figure out how that works and how we do that.
I think a data gap too that I don't know how we could fill it is kind of going back to the qualitative data that we need. So actually understanding community and residents' perception of what they see as, highest priority. Because again, like we can go in as a university saying, well, we're going to do this really great research study on how trees can make you happy or healthy or what have you. But if that's not kind of what they need, then that's kind of just doing research for research's sake. And I don't think any of us really want to do that. So I think understanding the perception of the communities and the residents who actually live there, I think is really important. So, and I know that there's great researchers here within the university that are doing some of that qualitative perception data gathering, which is really great.
And I'll just share among the RPCs, each RPC director tends to be a liaison to a programmatic or agency area, and mine is emergency planning, so it's been an interesting couple of years. And the data, I think, is really critical. One of my biggest fears has been when will we have a disaster that displaces lots of people? Because we really didn't have a plan for that, and we still don't have a plan for that. And then my worst fears were kind of realized in July. It's not like I'm some kind of sage. I've just lived in a lot of places that have been disastered. And I think we're going to be really critical to tease out. The initial FEMA data was that over 250 people, I think it was, were displaced out of the state, and 600 some odd people were displaced out of their zip code by the flooding. And I wouldn't be surprised, please don't quote me on this, but if we wind up losing maybe a couple thousand people to the floods, losing out of the state because they have nowhere else to go as buyouts happen, as properties come into compliance with National Flood Insurance Program and rents increase, and just as time takes over for those who can afford to leave might, coupled with out-migration that may just be driven by housing in general. I think that's a story we really need to own, because maybe that'll create some more impetus to do the investment that's needed in the infrastructure to actually support the thousands and thousands of housing units we need. I think there's somebody standing back there. You have a question?
Yeah, I guess I feel a little foolish now because my question has nothing to do with these sort of disasters of the magnitude now that you're talking about. But, we've kind of heard how the data assets and the data collection assets of UVM are being used to address, flooding in particular and the waste system stuff. And I was wondering about what other uses you see, or moreover, what processes may exist for soliciting ideas of what questions do communities and local governments have that UVM can bring their capabilities and assets to bear? How do you pull that information from down in the trenches to say, oh, we have a solution for that?
Can we organize a whole conference on that? Is that something awesome? I've got lots, but you guys go.
Unfortunate thing of having a conference where you work is that you have to jump away from meetings. And the meeting I had this morning was with people that were doing that were actually hey, we think this could be useful for the state to kind of figure these pieces out. So those conversations, I think, are partially just us meeting and working on other projects and be hey, this was cool. Have you thought about this? That's definitely a more informal system rather than a formal call for action kind of thing. I'm really curious. I've been running events as part of my office in the community and trying to find where I can get that traction and get those conversations started. And it's not entirely clear to me yet, but I think it takes time. It takes time of building trust and also being literally in the same space where someone can ask you a question. And that's time consuming and also very valuable in the end to have those cleanings.
I think what you just said about being in their space, being in the same space, being in their space is really important. I think it's sitting at a table with Rose or Monique Priestley, right? And really understanding it's being very careful not to be extractive, right? Not to be running into all of our small rural communities with 8,000 solutions that, we need all this data, right? But to really, move at that pace and navigate with that right brain, left brain, where the priorities are and what's bubbling up. And if it's not bubbling up in that community, that's okay, because maybe it's bubbling up somewhere else, right? So it really is, when I think about technology and data, right, the rate at which it's growing and the rate that our world is spinning is incredibly awesome. And it's also detrimental to the human connection piece, and taking space, right, for those relationships, for those conversations, to build that trust, right? So there's data, there's relationships, and so I think I am so excited about all the tools here, and we also need to be human and in how we make that outreach into communities.
And it's also being open to the surprises. Like, I'm currently talking to a couple different people about how you like openly publish medical programs, things that we're doing that are really cool, like someone else can use them. Not just like, oh, here's a white paper about this cool idea, but like, here's all the details to run this program. This is how we did it. This is all the forms you need. This is already, you can just import this into Epic. Like those kinds of things, like I didn't expect to be something I'm focusing on, but a conversation led me that way. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I never thought about that. Sorry, Paige, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna kind of piggyback off what you both had said about just like kind of sitting back and listening and not trying to come to the communities with so many different solutions, because again, that might not be what they're actually asking for. And I think being open to these creative solutions, right, that the communities actually can bring to us and be like, okay, now we have the research and expertise to actually tease that out and actually enact that change.
So our times, I just want to, from our perspective, my biggest issue is structural, and it's because of the way we're funded, I have to charge staff time to some programmatic thing. And so we tend to go to towns and say, here's what we're bringing to you, or we're asking you this specific question. I wish I just had the ability to just send people into town and say, what do you need? To just support what they need, as opposed to having a preconceived notion. I want to, this last Wendell Berry quote I want to share, because I think this ties this together. It's from his essay, The Loss of the University, but there's actually a rather hopeful quote. If the proper work of a university is only to equip people to fulfill private ambitions, then how do we justify public support? If it is only to prepare citizens to fulfill public responsibilities, then how do we justify the teaching of arts and sciences? The common denominator has to be larger than either career preparation or preparation for citizenship. Underlying the idea of a university, the bringing together, the combining into one of all the disciplines, is the idea that good work and good citizenship are the inevitable byproducts of the making of a good that is a fully developed human being. This, as I understand it, is the definition of the name university. So thank you so much to my colleagues up here. Thank you for your attention, and thanks to the Institute.